The morning sunlight gently awakened Elizabeth Grayson's eyes as it streamed through the window. Even at 65, the habits from her 30-plus years as an elementary school teacher hadn't faded easily. She slowly sat up and glanced at the family photo on her bedside table. "Good morning, Jake," Elizabeth whispered softly. The sight of her 6-year-old grandson's innocent smile in the photo tugged at her heart. Her single-story house in a quiet residential area of Westchester County had once been filled with laughter. Now, the silence weighed heavily on her heart. As she went through her morning routine, the events of the past 2 years flashed through Elizabeth's mind like a slideshow. It started 2 years ago with the devastating news that Sarah, her son Michael's wife, had died in a car accident. Then, 6 months ago, her beloved grandson Jake suddenly disappeared. Why? Elizabeth sighed deeply as she brewed coffee in the kitchen. As the aroma filled the room, her eyes unconsciously drifted to Jake's photo on the living room wall. It captured his smile, frozen in time just before he went missing. The police had investigated seriously for the first month. But as time passed without any decisive leads, their enthusiasm waned. When it seemed the case might be labeled unsolved, Elizabeth made a decision. She had to take action herself. She pulled out her old teaching notebooks and began organizing information. She distributed posters at the local community center, spread information on social media, and sometimes even traveled far to chase down dubious rumors. "Elizabeth, don't push yourself too hard alone," her friends often worried. But Elizabeth had no intention of stopping. "I still have things I can do," she would say, going about her days. After finishing breakfast, Elizabeth went out to the garden. Tending to the flower bed was an important time for her to calm her mind. But today, the sound of children's voices from the neighboring house made her pause. "Jake, where are you?" Her voice calling her grandson's name was carried away by the wind. In the morning, she volunteered at the local library. Reading books to children was a happy time for Elizabeth. But it also reminded her of Jake's smile. "Grandma, what story is next?" Jake's voice, often asking that question, still lingered in her ears. After leaving the library, Elizabeth passed by Michael's house as usual. He had become so absorbed in work that he rarely wanted to talk about Jake's disappearance. Still, Elizabeth passed by here every day, unable to let go of the faint hope that maybe. "Michael, you're suffering too, aren't you?" Looking up at the light seeping through the windows, Elizabeth imagined her son's inner turmoil. Losing Sarah, and now Jake too. The thought of his pain made her heart ache. Back home in the evening, Elizabeth looked at the maps and notes spread out on the living room table. They contained detailed information from her search efforts. Though none had led to a decisive clue, she added new information without losing heart. "Tomorrow, I'll look into that rumor a bit more," Elizabeth said, penning her plans for the next day. It was already dark outside, but her eyes held a determined light. Before bed, she gazed at the family photo again. Sarah's smile, Jake's innocent expression, and Michael's gentle gaze. The memory of those happy days sent a pang through her chest. Jake. I promise I'll find you, Elizabeth vowed quietly. Tomorrow, her search would continue. And she believed that someday, they would all be able to take a new family photo together. Lying in bed, Elizabeth reflected on the day. The days of searching were wearing on her heart and body. But she couldn't give up. Tomorrow might bring new information. With that faint hope in her chest, Elizabeth quietly closed her eyes. Elizabeth woke early, reviewing her planned actions for today in her head. After breakfast, she left the house with a determined expression. Another day of searching for Jake was about to begin. Her first destination was the local community center. Elizabeth, carrying handmade posters, headed for the center's bulletin board. There were already various notices posted, but she skillfully rearranged them, pinning up the paper with Jake's smiling photo in the center. "Has anyone seen this child?" Elizabeth whispered softly. She hurried to the next destination, praying that it would catch the eye of visitors to the center. The local church, supermarket, park. Elizabeth walked all over town, putting up posters wherever she was allowed. Even as she dragged her tired feet, her eyes held a strong will. Back home, Elizabeth sat in front of her computer. Spreading information on social media was a new challenge for her. Though she had been hesitant at first, now her fingers flew over the keyboard with practiced ease. "Please, someone with information." Elizabeth prayed in her heart each time she sent a post. A few days later, Elizabeth visited her son Michael's house. Since Jake's disappearance, there had been something off about Michael's attitude. Today, that feeling of unease grew stronger. "Mom, don't you think it's time to give up the search?" Michael said coldly. "Why?" "Jake is your son." Elizabeth looked straight into her son's eyes. "We should accept reality. Even the police." Michael's words trailed off. To Elizabeth, it seemed like his eyes were hiding something. "Michael, do you know something?" "Nothing." Michael averted his gaze. This conversation planted a new seed of doubt in Elizabeth's heart. Her son's behavior was too unnatural. Could he be hiding some crucial information? A few days later, Elizabeth was having tea with a group of neighborhood housewives. The topic naturally turned to Jake's disappearance. "Elizabeth, actually." The woman living next door spoke up. "I've been hearing strange noises at night recently." Elizabeth held her breath. "What kind of noises?" "Like a child crying, but I'm not sure." At this information, Elizabeth's heart began to race. Could it be? But that was too terrible a thought. The next day, knowing Michael would be away on a business trip, Elizabeth decided to visit her son's house again. Ostensibly to tend to the plants. The front door was slightly ajar. Elizabeth hesitated but decided to enter. "Michael?" No response. Silence dominated the house. Elizabeth walked around inside. Everything looked normal. But she stopped in front of the basement door. That door, which should usually be firmly closed, was slightly open. Her heartbeat quickened. Elizabeth touched the doorknob with a trembling hand. Jake. She called her grandson's name with a voice mixed with faint hope and fear. There was no answer, but she thought she heard a faint sound from somewhere far away. Elizabeth took a deep breath. She couldn't imagine what lay ahead. But she needed to know the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. Slowly, she began to descend the basement stairs. One step, then another. With each step, doubts grew within Elizabeth. Michael's unnatural behavior, the strange noises at night, and now this slightly open basement door. Everything seemed to suggest something. Elizabeth reached the bottom of the stairs. In the darkness, she waited for her eyes to adjust to the light. And then, as Elizabeth's eyes adjusted to the darkness, the outline of the basement gradually came into view. The damp air clung to her skin, and a faint smell of dust tickled her nose. With her heartbeat pounding in her ears, she cautiously took a step forward. "Jake," she called out softly. Then, from the darkness, she heard a faint sound. Elizabeth held her breath and slowly moved towards the source of the noise. There, under a dim light bulb, she saw a small figure huddled. "Jake!" Elizabeth couldn't help but cry out. Seeing her grandson chained up, a sharp pain shot through Elizabeth's chest. She rushed to Jake's side and touched his cheek with trembling hands. "Grandma." Jake's voice was weak and filled with fear. "It's okay, Jake. Grandma's here," Elizabeth said, holding back tears. "I'll get you out of here right away." She desperately tried to remove the chains. But Jake's next words made her stop. "Save Mom first." Jake suddenly cried out. Elizabeth's face showed confusion. "But your mother." The words caught in her throat. Sarah was supposed to have died in an accident 2 years ago. So why was Jake asking to save his mother? "Mom's over there," Jake pointed to the next room. Elizabeth's mind went blank. She slowly stood up and walked unsteadily towards the next room. When she opened the door, "Sarah!" Elizabeth's voice trembled. In the corner of the dimly lit room was the figure of an emaciated woman. The face peeking out from under the long, unkempt hair was undoubtedly Sarah's. "Elizabeth." Sarah's voice was hoarse, but she was definitely alive. Elizabeth felt like her knees would give way. Sarah, who was supposed to be dead, was here. Moreover, she was being held captive by her son Michael. The situation seemed unreal, and Elizabeth's head was in utter confusion. Why? Michael? Questions she couldn't put into words kept welling up. Sarah weakly shook her head. "It's a long story. But now..." At that moment, they heard a sound from upstairs. The three of them held their breath. "Dad's back," Jake's voice trembled. Elizabeth made a split-second decision. "Stay quiet. I'll hide." She quickly hid herself in the darkness. Her heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would jump out of her throat. Footsteps coming down the stairs slowly approached. Michael entered the basement. Elizabeth held her breath and watched her son's movements. After checking on Jake and Sarah, Michael muttered something to himself and went back up the stairs. When the footsteps faded away, Elizabeth let out a sigh of relief. But there was no time to relax. She hurried back to Jake and Sarah. "Are you both all right?" Elizabeth asked in a low voice. Sarah nodded weakly. "Elizabeth, please help us." Elizabeth's face showed determination. "I'll definitely get you out. But we can't do it right now. If Michael notices." She quickly formulated a plan in her head. Should she report to the police, or should they attempt to escape on their own? Either way, they needed to act carefully. "Listen, both of you," Elizabeth said quietly but firmly. "I'll definitely come back to help you. Until then, hang in there." Jake and Sarah looked anxious but nodded. Elizabeth hugged them one last time and then carefully left the basement, making sure not to make any noise. As she climbed the stairs, her head was full of complex thoughts. Anger towards her son, worry for Sarah and Jake, and above all, the urgency and anxiety of how to resolve this situation. However, Elizabeth renewed her determination. She would definitely rescue the two of them. And she would uncover the truth behind her son's actions. As she left the house, Elizabeth looked back once. The house that looked unchanged on the surface. But the terrifying truth hidden in its basement. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. It would be a long and dangerous battle. But Elizabeth had no choice but to go back. To save her family and reveal the truth, her new fight had begun. On Sunday night, as the clock struck 11:30, Elizabeth crept up to the back door of Michael's house, holding her breath. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears. She quietly opened the door and headed for the basement. "Sarah, Jake," Elizabeth whispered. From the darkness, two shadows approached. It was Sarah and Jake. "Michael?" Sarah asked in a low voice. "He's drunk and asleep," Elizabeth answered. "Let's hurry." The three of them cautiously began to climb the stairs. Thanks to Jake's knowledge of his father's behavior patterns, they knew which stairs would creak. However, in her tension, Elizabeth's foot slipped for a moment, breaking the silence with a faint sound. The three froze in place. "Who's there?" Michael's voice came from upstairs. Elizabeth made a split-second decision and whispered, "Jake," Michael's cell phone. Jake acted quickly. He grabbed the cell phone left on the living room table and began dialing 911. "This is Michael Grayson's house. There are kidnapped hostages here. Please hurry." At that moment, they heard Michael's footsteps rushing down the stairs. "What the hell? You guys!" Michael's angry shout echoed throughout the house. "Run!" Elizabeth yelled. The three of them dashed towards the back door. But Michael's footsteps were getting closer. "I won't let you go anywhere." There was madness in Michael's voice. As soon as Elizabeth stepped into the garden, she spotted a large flower pot. Sarah, Jake, go ahead. She summoned all her strength to lift the flower pot and threw it at the pursuing Michael. Ugh! Michael stumbled, tripping over the flower pot. Taking advantage of that moment, Elizabeth started running with all her might. She could see Sarah and Jake turning the corner of the street. Wait! You traitors! Michael's shout broke the night's silence. Elizabeth ran desperately. However, perhaps due to her age, she soon found herself out of breath. Michael's footsteps were getting closer. It's over, Mom, Michael's voice came from right behind her. At that moment, a familiar house caught Elizabeth's eye. It was the home of Sarah's friend, Jennifer. Summoning her last ounce of strength, Elizabeth rushed to Jennifer's front door. Jennifer! Help! She desperately pounded on the door. The door opened. Jennifer's surprised face appeared. Elizabeth! What's wrong? Let me in. Quickly. Elizabeth turned around. Michael was almost upon her. Mom, stop. Michael's eyes were bloodshot. Are you trying to ruin everything? Jennifer seemed to immediately grasp the situation. She pulled Elizabeth into the house and slammed the door shut. I'm calling the police. Jennifer immediately headed for the phone. Elizabeth collapsed onto the floor. For a while, she couldn't speak due to her rapid heartbeat and shortness of breath. Outside, Michael continued to shout. Open up. Mom, what have you done? But his voice was soon drowned out by the sound of sirens. Elizabeth finally took a deep breath. I hope Sarah and Jake are safe. Jennifer placed a hand on her shoulder. It's okay, Elizabeth. You're safe now. Police sirens broke the night's silence as patrol cars arrived one after another. Michael was arrested without resistance, handcuffed and shoved into a patrol car. His eyes were a mix of anger and regret. Elizabeth. Sarah and Jake's voices brought Elizabeth back to her senses. She rushed over and hugged them tightly. It's finally over, Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. Over the next few days, the whole town was in an uproar. The news reported on this incident daily, and the local community was deeply shocked. However, at the same time, an amazing circle of support began to spread. Local psychologists offered free therapy, real estate agents arranged temporary housing. Neighbors brought in meals, and children were kind to Jake. The trial began 2 months later. Michael's crimes were revealed in court. Imprisonment for Sarah's huge inheritance, creation of a false death certificate, and long-term abuse. The evidence was overwhelming. On the final day, before the verdict, Michael was given a last chance to speak. He stood up and turned towards Sarah, Jake, and Elizabeth. I've done something unforgivable, his voice trembled. Blinded by greed, I hurt my precious family. Mom, Sarah, Jake. I'm truly sorry. The courtroom fell silent. Elizabeth looked at her son with complex emotions. Anger and sadness, and a faint pity swirled in her chest. The sentence was 25 years in prison. Michael was led out of the courtroom with his head bowed. 3 months have passed since then. Sarah and Jake have started a new life in a new apartment, and Elizabeth visits almost daily. Today, too, she came with a homemade apple pie. "Grandma." Jake ran up to her happily. "Jake, how was school?" Elizabeth asked, hugging her grandson. "It was fun. I got a perfect score on my math test today." Sarah poked her head out from the kitchen. "Elizabeth, thank you as always." The three of them gathered around the dining table, enjoying a peaceful moment. Sunlight streaming through the window brightly illuminated the room. "Hey," Sarah quietly began, "I wonder what will happen to us from now on." Elizabeth looked at their faces. Anxiety and hope were intertwined there. "It's okay," Elizabeth said gently. "We have each other. Let's overcome this together." Jake placed his small hand on top of Sarah and Elizabeth's hands. "Yes. We're family, after all." Elizabeth felt a warmth in her chest. Indeed, they were still wounded. It would take time to heal. But at this moment, she was certain. They would surely overcome this. And they would find new happiness. Outside the window, the spring breeze gently swayed the trees. Like the beginning of a new season, their new life was about to start from here.